I still play a lot of classic handheld games from time to time, whether it be games from the original Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Atari Lynx, or even the DS, PSP, and 3DS. I've always been fascinated by handhelds since I was a kid playing the original Game Boy. I would even use the Super Game Boy and Game Boy Player accessories to play Game Boy games on my TV back in the day. Recently, as I was going back to the Atari Lynx library in particular, I kept thinking about one thing. How did Nintendo beat all of its competitors in the handheld market? The Lynx certainly could have been a formidable foe. How did the Game Boy win so easily? First, let's talk about some of the reasons that I think are overrated in these conversations about older handhelds and why most of them didn't even come close to competing with Nintendo. The first factor that I think gets overrated is cost. A lot of people are quick to point out how cheap Nintendo handhelds usually were. That certainly helped, it was certainly a factor. However, there were some competitors that were cheap, like the Atari Supervision and the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Those systems were cheap for their respective time periods, and that alone did not make them successful, however. So cost isn't everything. Plus, people don't care about cost if they feel like it's worth playing anyway, especially when we're talking about video game systems. The second overrated factor is battery life. Sure, that was usually an advantage for many Nintendo handhelds, especially early on. However, the Neo Geo Pocket Color and WonderSwan had better battery life than the Game Boy Color. But that didn't matter a whole lot at the end of the day. Worst case scenario with old handhelds, you could have always gotten an AC adapter. Even the Atari Lynx had one. One of my cousins had one for the original Game Boy back in the day, even though that handheld wasn't that bad in terms of battery life for the time. Then again, even the OG Game Boy ate a lot of batteries, as it took 4 of them. And I know my parents weren't usually in a rush to go buy AA batteries as soon as I was out of them. Plus, battery life became less of a factor once we got to the DS and PSP, as those had rechargeable batteries. Battery life didn't hold back the PSP much, honestly, even though it had much worse battery life than the DS. Plus, the 3DS and Switch did just fine despite being much worse than the DS in this regard as well. However, I do think there are 3 bigger reasons why Nintendo's handhelds have been victorious since the Game Boy. The first of these factors has to be distribution. Many of Nintendo's earlier competitors in the market suffered from major distribution issues. The Atari Lynx had a hard time getting on store shelves during its lifespan because Atari had a hard time manufacturing them, especially early on. Plus, they struggled with distribution for the Atari 7800 as well, and even the Jaguar. So this has been a problem for a while for Atari. Another example. How often did you see the n-gage at a Walmart? I know I don't remember seeing one there. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had problems with this as well. And the WonderSwan didn't even get released outside of Japan. On the other hand, the PSP did not have these issues because Sony was fantastic at distribution, considering how successful the PS1 and PS2 had been up to that point, and they obviously had money. 2. Marketing is always a major factor. If people don't know about your system, even if it's on store shelves, it is doomed. The Game Gear was a big victim of this, even though it sold about 10 million units. Sega was so caught up trying to sell the Sega CD, the 32X, and later the Saturn, that the Game Gear took a back seat in terms of marketing. If Sega would have consistently marketed the Game Gear properly, instead of getting obsessed with doing add-ons for the Genesis, it would have had a much better shot at competing with Nintendo, even though it did have other issues that held it back. Many other competitors had issues competing with Nintendo in advertising as well, like the Atari Lynx and the Neo Geo Pocket Color. The only one that didn't was the PSP. However, Sony dropped the ball with the Vita's marketing later on. That is a great example of how bad marketing can tank a system. The third, and in my opinion the biggest reason why Nintendo handhelds have won since the original Game Boy comes down to the games, particularly original games. As a console maker and game developer, Nintendo has always been invested in creating unique, original games for their handhelds and offering experiences uniquely tailored to their hardware. It is the same approach they take with their home consoles, not just their handhelds. When the original Game Boy came out, they did not give you Super Mario Bros. Over again. They gave gamers the Super Mario Land series instead. And then that was spin off into the Wario Land series, which featured a different gameplay style focusing less on traditional platforming and more on puzzles, but that series mostly stayed on handhelds. Wario would eventually get another series in WarioWare, starting on the GBA, which focused on microgames instead of just being a platformer. Kirby started out on handhelds. The first Kirby game, Kirby's Dream Land, was made for the original Game Boy, and Kirby has had a big presence on Nintendo handhelds since, though some Kirby games would be made for consoles like Kirby's Adventure and Kirby 64. And one of the biggest Nintendo franchises of all time, Pokemon, started out on Game Boy as well, and stayed on handhelds, at least for the main series. Pokemon arguably revived the Game Boy in North America once that craze started to take off by the late 90s. I know back in 99 and 2000 for me, I was obsessed with that and the WWF more than anything else going on at the time. Those things were almost my life back then. Even in later handhelds like the DS and 3DS, you saw this approach as well. Look at how successful games like New Super Mario Bros., Metroid Prime Hunters, and Nintendogs were on the DS. The Brain Age franchise and Clubhouse games started out on the DS as well. The 3DS had Super Mario 3D Land and A Link Between Worlds, and the Pokemon games sold well on the system. For the Switch, they went back to their formula, creating original games yet again, like Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, and Animal Crossing New Horizons, and it worked like a charm. They didn't need a Call of Duty game to sell the Switch, or Madden NFL for that matter. I'm not saying third-party support didn't matter at all for the Switch, but the best-selling games list for that system has hardly any third-party games in the top 50. On a side note, it was kind of funny to see people online jumping to conclusions about the Switch before it launched in 2017. I remember all the hype about it, all the speculation. Once I found out it was going to be a hybrid between a handheld and a console, I thought it was going to do just fine, despite a lot of people bashing it for being underpowered. Of course, we now know how successful it turned out, so hindsight is 2020. That's not to say that every classic game released by them on their own handhelds was totally original. After all, Tetris was not their creation technically, but the Game Boy got a version of it at launch time because Nintendo got the license for the series for non-Japanese consoles and handhelds back then. So that was obviously a big system seller. And the Game Boy Advance was known for having a lot of ports and remakes, even from Nintendo, but they were extremely well done and the demand was there for those remakes at the time. Plus, the system had the hardware to handle them, and it did not have a strong competitor until the PSP. Even the Game Boy Color got some ports like Super Mario Bros. DX and Donkey Kong Country. But overall, Nintendo has always vested in original games for their handhelds with great success. On the other hand, let's take a look at some of their competitors from back in the day. The Game Gear did not have a lot of standout original games, as it featured a lot of games that were either already on the Master System or on the Genesis. Now yes, it was cool to have what was essentially a portable Master System, but that alone was not going to cut it when Nintendo was banging out great game after great game that you could not get on their home consoles. Of course, Sega mismanagement and bad marketing in the long run did not help, nor did the battery life of the Game Gear. However, imagine if Sega would have created an original game for the Game Gear on par with Tetris, Link's Awakening, or better yet, an RPG on par with Pokemon, back in, let's say, 92 or 93, but in full color. People may have been willing to suffer through terrible battery life for that, especially if the marketing was strong. A handful of exclusive killer apps with serious mainstream appeal and great marketing early on in the system's lifespan could have changed its fate entirely. The Atari Lynx, which I am a fan of and will cover more on this channel in the future, didn't have enough great original games, and had a serious lack of platformers and RPGs, for example. Granted, it needed more games in general, and as great as a lot of the arcade ports were for the time, you couldn't sell a home system of any kind with arcade ports by the beginning of the 1990s. It needed more original games, like Chip's Challenge, Todd's Adventures in Slime World, Blue Lightning and Warbirds, with the latter two games being two extremely impressive flight games for the time. If it had more original games on par with those, the system could have done a little bit better. However, Epyx, the company that made Chip's Challenge, Todd's Adventures in Slime World, and Blue Lightning, was crippled by financial problems by 1991. That did not help, so Atari's in-house teams, and whoever else they could hire to develop games for the system, were left to try to carry the Lynx, since they had almost no third-party support. Also, the Atari Lynx had problems just getting the system onto the shelves in the first place, as I mentioned earlier. Even the PSP, as well as it did, had a lot of ports and remakes that didn't stand out much and ultimately failed to convince gamers to buy the system over the DS. Even a lot of the spin-offs of console games didn't stand out either. The one original game that got the closest to being a major system seller back in the day was Liberty City Stories. But that wasn't even a first-party game. That was Rockstar doing the work to make a GTA game on the system that was very close to GTA 3 on PS2, not Sony's work. I remember back when I was in high school when the PSP came out, and people were going nuts about it because the games looked amazing and you could watch movies on it. Honestly, as a DS owner and Nintendo fanboy back then, it was a bit tough back in 2005, as the DS still hadn't caught on that well yet, as it didn't have that many killer games early on, and it really wouldn't catch fire until the end of 2005 into 2006. Once the DS caught on though, the rest was history obviously, and it wasn't even a close fight in the end. A lot of my peers that were hyping up the PSP probably didn't even buy it, because once that initial hype died down a bit, people realized that the game library just wasn't enough to beat the DS, even though it was still a very successful system in its own right in the long run and had plenty of good games. Even the multimedia capabilities were not enough either, especially later on once smartphones started to become a thing and people realized that UMDs just weren't very good. And now a lot of people will point out that the PSP was easily hackable and piracy was a problem as a result. But the DS also had piracy issues, as that system wasn't super secure either. That might explain software sales being lower, but piracy does not necessarily affect hardware sales the same way. If anything, the PSP being so powerful at the time and hackable probably helped sell more units than otherwise. The Vita, on the other hand, was much harder to crack, but failed miserably for a few different reasons, mostly because of almost non-existent marketing. Going back to games again, the PSP just didn't have a lot of games that sold well. Liberty City Stories on PSP, the best-selling game for that system, sold over 8 million copies, which is pretty good. However, New Super Mario Bros. For the DS sold over 30 million. Those were the two best-selling games for each of those systems. And know that once again, each one of these is an original game and not a port. The DS clearly won when it came to games. But just to clarify, the PSP was not a bad system, and overall it was still a success. There were plenty of good games to play, even if a lot of them were remakes and ports. It just lacked when it came to killer apps that you could not get anywhere else. Original games matter, and do not underestimate Nintendo and their upcoming Switch successor. Whether it's called the Switch 2, the Nintendo Focus, or something else. While I am not a fan of their business practices and their attitudes toward preservation and consumers at large, they have an excellent reputation when it comes to handhelds for a reason. They have dominated that market. I'm not going to underestimate Nintendo and their next console, especially if they're going with the hybrid approach again. I know the speculation is running wild, and while it's fun to speculate about Nintendo's next system, I expect them to stick to their formula of creating great original exclusive games, even if they throw in some new hardware gimmick. I think the only thing that could stop them is if they had a marketing disaster like they did with the Wii U. Or they try way too hard to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, like they did with the original Wii. and I don't think there's a big appetite for that right now. I also think they need to have backwards compatibility with the original Switch, but then again, the original Switch did not have backwards compatibility with the 3DS or Wii U, so maybe the next console can succeed without that. So anyways, what did you think of Nintendo's classic handhelds? Do any of you remember the competitors like the PSP, the Game Gear, and the Atari Lynx? Do you remember the DS versus PSP war of the mid-2000s like I do? Do you own one of these failed competitors, or you had one of them growing up? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and consider subscribing for more videos like this, as well as playthroughs of classic games done with no continues or cheats. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.